It had been 9 days. 9 days since the great silver wolf, the largest, most feared beast in all of Valdres Keep, had planted himself outside cell 44 in the underground holding ward and refused to move. 9 days since the guards had stopped trying to drag him away, after losing 3 men to cracked ribs and torn armor in the attempt. 9 days since head warden Boris Keld had stopped bringing the wolf his meat, because the wolf simply sat there and let the food rot beside him. 9 days of the most powerful alpha wolf in the northern continent curling his massive body against the cold iron bars of a prison cell, and pressing his silver muzzle through the gap, not to growl, not to threaten, but to rest his enormous head on the flagstone floor inside, as close as he could get to the woman chained in the corner. She had not spoken a word either. Not to the magistrate, not to the physician they had briefly sent down, not to the 2 guards who slid food beneath the cell door each morning, which she also left untouched. The only sound that ever came from either of them was this, a low, broken whimper the wolf made each time she shifted position in her chains. A sound so raw, so unguarded, coming from a creature that had once leveled entire enemy battalions in wolf form, that the youngest guard on night duty had reportedly wept at his post. 9 days, Your Grace. Warden Boris Keld stood at the top of the stone staircase leading down into the holding ward, his voice barely above a murmur, as if he was afraid, truly afraid, that speaking any louder might be heard below and trigger something terrible. Alpha King Garrett Dragmore did not turn around. He stood with his back to the warden, facing the narrow slit of a window that overlooked the frozen valley below Valdres Keep. His hands were clasped behind him. His jaw was tight, so tight the muscle beneath his cheekbone pulsed rhythmically, like a second heartbeat. 9 days, Boris repeated carefully. He has eaten nothing, Your Grace. The wolf, he watches anyone who approaches the cell. 3 men still cannot lift a shield without pain. We cannot explain it. You gave him no command to guard her. No one gave him that command. He simply chose. The Alpha King said nothing. Outside, a bitter northern wind screamed across the valley walls, driving snow sideways in thick, blinding sheets. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth behind Garrett crackled against the cold, throwing his shadow long and dark across the floor. His council had been in this room 40 minutes ago, all 6 of them seated at the long war table, speaking in the careful, diplomatic tones of men who were really saying something much more frightening than their chosen words suggested. High Steward Dirk Acheron had led the conversation, as he always did, his thin fingers laced on the table, his voice smooth as river ice. The court is watching, my king. What the court sees is this, the royal werewolf, your bonded beast, the creature that answers only to your blood, sitting at the feet of the woman accused of conspiring to murder you. The symbolism is not subtle. Some are saying the wolf knows something the court does not. Others are saying you have lost control of your own bond. Both readings are dangerous. Lord Commander Evren Stoke had been less polished. Execute her, Garrett. End the spectacle. The wolf will come home when she no longer draws him. Garrett had looked at Stoke with eyes so flat and cold that the man had stopped speaking mid-breath. Leave me, Garrett had said. They had left. Now there was only Boris, shifting his weight nervously at the top of the stairs. Bring me the record of the night she was arrested, Garrett said. His voice was low and very quiet and somehow worse for it. Your Grace, the High Steward has already reviewed the... Boris. Yes, my king. The record now. The warden went. Garrett finally turned from the window, and in the absence of any witness he let the mask drop for precisely 3 seconds. His pale gray eyes, the color of the sky before a storm breaks, showed what they always hid. Not rage, not confusion. Fear. A deep, corrosive, terrifying fear that sat in his chest like a coal that would not cool. He had been standing in the great hall 11 days ago, in the middle of the midwinter accord ceremony, surrounded by 300 nobles, 12 foreign dignitaries, and his entire inner court. The ceremonial wine, the Unity Cup, passed between the Alpha King and the visiting Lord of the Southern Reaches at the close of every accord had been placed in his hand. He had raised it to his lips, and Zorica Vane had knocked it from his hand so violently that the wine had sprayed across the throat of Lord Edric Thorne, who had stumbled backward shrieking, because the wine was eating through his collar like acid eating through cloth. Not wine. Something that had been placed inside the wine. Something that would have eaten through Garrett from the inside. But the court had not seen the disintegrating collar in the chaos that followed. They had seen Zorica Vane, the official appointed record keeper, a woman with no title, no guard rank, no formal standing, grabbing the Alpha King's arm with one hand and producing a short, curved blade from her sleeve with the other. The guards had her down in 4 seconds. Garrett had stood there, the Unity Cup shattered on the marble floor, the assembly erupting around him, and Zorica had not said a word. She had not struggled. She had not looked at the guards pinning her to the ground. She had only looked at him with those amber-brown eyes wide and urgent, and then she had very deliberately looked at the cup on the floor and then back at him. He had not understood. And then Dirk Acheron had appeared at his elbow too quickly, Garrett thought now, far too quickly, and said, quietly, close to his ear, "She has been paid by the Reach's delegates, my king. We found the correspondence in her chambers this morning. She intended to use the chaos of the ceremony. Take her down." And Garrett, still disoriented, still watching the red wine pool across the marble, had given the order. He had put her in the dark. His werewolf, who had been lying at the foot of the dais as he always was during ceremonies, had followed her down to the cells, and had not come back. Garrett pressed one hand flat against the stone wall and breathed. He was a man who had fought 12 battles, a man who had shifted into full wolf form at the age of 16 and held that form for 3 unbroken days during his alpha trial, a feat that still stood as record in the northern packs. A man who did not flinch, did not hesitate, and did not doubt. He was doubting now, because in 9 days, nobody had explained the collar. Lord Edric Thorne had quietly had it removed and replaced before anyone thought to examine it. And when Garrett had asked Dirk for the collar 3 days ago, casually, as if it was a minor administrative matter, Dirk had told him with that smooth, practiced regret that the staff had discarded it. Evidence gone. His werewolf, not gone, still below, still waiting. Garrett straightened. He walked to the door. He opened it himself without calling for a guard. "No one comes down with me," he said to the 2 sentries in the corridor, not breaking stride. He went down alone. The holding ward of Valdres Keep was built from black granite quarried out of the mountain itself, and the cold down here was not the ordinary cold of winter. It was a living thing, patient and mean, working its way into the bones with quiet determination. Torches burned in iron brackets, but their light was weak and sour, the kind of light that showed you enough to make the darkness worse by contrast. Garrett heard the wolf before he saw him. Not a growl, not a warning. A soft, continuous sound, low, steady, barely there. The kind of sound a wolf makes when it is keeping vigil, when it refuses to acknowledge that time is passing, because acknowledgement would mean accepting that the one it watches over might not survive the wait. Garrett turned the corner of the last corridor. Merc, for that was the werewolf's name, the name Garrett had given him when they bonded at age 12, when the silver-pelted pup had chosen him over every other alpha candidate by walking straight across a crowded pen and sitting on his feet. Merc was enormous. Even curled as he was, pressed against the bars of cell 44, he filled most of the corridor. His coat was the color of moonlight on snow. His paws, each the size of a man's chest, were folded against the bars like hands pressed against a door. He heard Garrett's footsteps, and his head lifted immediately. Those amber eyes, so eerily close to human in their intelligence, fixed on the Alpha King and held. Merk did not move away from the bars. He did not come forward to greet his bonded Alpha. He did not drop his gaze in the submissive acknowledgement that every wolf in the kingdom gave to Garrett instinctively. He looked at him, level, waiting, as if asking, "Are you ready to hear the truth now?" "Merk," Garrett said. His voice was rough. The wolf exhaled through his nose, a long, slow breath, and pressed his muzzle back through the bars. Garrett walked forward until he was close enough to see into the cell. She was in the corner. She had been given a rough wool blanket, which she had arranged with precise, almost deliberate dignity around her shoulders, as if she had decided that if she was going to be caged, she was going to be caged on her own terms. The chains on her wrists were long enough that she could move around the cell, and she had used that range to position herself exactly where she wanted, her back to the corner, her sight line clear to the door, one hand resting in the thick silver fur of Merk's neck through the bars. Zorica Vane. She was not what the court had ever known what to make of, which was probably part of why this had been easy to believe of her. She was not noble, not common-born, not warrior, not servant. She had been, before 11 days ago, the king's appointed record-keeper, the keeper of the Accord documents, the person in the room who noticed everything and wrote it down and was therefore, systematically, overlooked by everyone. She was perhaps 24 years old. She had the kind of face that was easy to trust and hard to read at the same time, warm amber-brown eyes that picked up light like cut glass, a straight, serious mouth, ink-stained fingers that she was currently using to stroke Merk's fur with an attention that looked almost like prayer. She did not look up when Garrett stopped outside the bars. Merk made that low sound again. Zorica's hand stilled in his fur. Then she said, without raising her eyes, "He's eating less than I am, and I haven't eaten in 3 days. If you're here to execute me, could you feed him first?" It was not a question. Garrett stared at her. Something moved in his chest, something large and uncomfortable that he did not have a name for yet. "Look at me," he said. She looked up, and Garrett felt the full weight of those amber eyes, steady as stones at the bottom of a clear river, and thought, not for the first time since her arrest, but for the first time that he let himself think it clearly, "She does not look like a woman who tried to kill me. She looked like a woman who was very tired and very cold, and had made a decision she intended to stand by regardless of what it cost her." "Why won't you speak to the magistrate?" he asked. "Because the magistrate reports to Dirk Acheron," she said, simple, flat, like a fact she had decided to stop dressing up. The name landed in the air between them. Garrett kept his face still. "That is a dangerous accusation." "It is not an accusation," Zorica said. She finally let her gaze drop back to Merk, not in submission, but in the way someone looks away when they are choosing their words. "It is an observation. I am the record keeper. Observing is what I do." A pause. Or did. Merk had shifted his massive head during this exchange, watching Garrett with that unblinking amber gaze. Now the wolf pressed forward against the bars, as close to Garrett as he could get, not aggressive. Something else. Something that felt terribly like pleading. "Tell me what happened," Garrett said. "Not what the magistrate asked. Not what Dirk wrote in his report. Tell me what you saw." For the first time, something flickered across Zorica Vane's face. Something quick and raw and gone again in an instant. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Close the corridor door first." Garrett turned. He walked back to the iron corridor door. He closed it. The bolt was on the outside. He left it unbolted. When he turned back, Zorica Vane was already speaking. 11 days ago, 2 hours before the Accord ceremony. Zorica's voice had the particular quality of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say in the silence of a prison cell for 9 days, not to polish it, but to hold it together, to keep it from falling apart under the weight of how frightened she was. "I was in the document archive, off the east corridor of the Great Hall. I was making the final seal impressions on the accord parchment, the ones that have to be done the day of in front of a witness. Lord Steward Acheron was supposed to send a witness from his office. He always does. Garrett said nothing. He had leaned one shoulder against the wall outside the bars. His arms were folded. His face gave away nothing, but his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were locked on her with an intensity she could feel like pressure. "The witness didn't come," Zorica said. "Instead, after about 20 minutes, I heard voices in the corridor outside the archive. The door was ajar. I didn't announce myself because," a brief hesitation, "because one of the voices was Lord Acheron, and the other voice was speaking in a register I had never heard him use with anyone. Low, like he was trying to make the words small." Garrett's jaw tightened, one small movement. "I heard him say it has to be the cup. If it touches his hands before it touches his lips, it will not work. The compound only activates with heat, body heat, so the effect begins the moment he closes his fingers around the stem." Zorica paused. Her hand had tightened in Merrick's fur, and the wolf had pressed closer against the bars, a steady, warm weight. The other voice asked about witnesses. Lord Acheron said, "There are no witnesses. The record keeper is already in position to be useful after the fact." The silence in the corridor was absolute. "He meant to make it look like I had placed it," Zorica said. Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper now, not from fear but from the effort of keeping it level. "Whatever was in the cup, I didn't know yet what it was. He had already decided that I was going to be the one who had put it there. I was the record keeper. I had access to everything. I had no title, no protector, no family at court. I was convenient." Garrett had stopped breathing for a moment. He thought of Dirk Acheron, with his thin fingers and his river-smooth voice, appearing at his elbow 40 seconds after Zorica had knocked the cup to the floor. "She has been paid by the Reach's delegates, my king. We found the correspondence in her chambers this morning." 40 seconds. The hall was in chaos. The correspondence was in her chambers. The correspondence that Dirk had somehow already found, during a ceremony he was supposed to be attending, in chambers that were on the opposite wing of the keep. "You didn't run," Garrett said. Not an accusation. More like a man checking whether a map is oriented correctly before he trusts it. "I couldn't run," Zorica said. "If I ran, you were going to drink that cup and you were going to die, and I would have been a fugitive accused of murdering the Alpha King instead of just this." She looked around the cell briefly. "Besides." She stopped. "Besides," he said. She looked down at Merrick. The wolf had shifted so that his chin was resting across her forearm where it lay across her knee. She stroked the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, and the enormous war wolf, who had once brought down a charging destrier in full battle, closed his eyes like a puppy. "I had already decided," Zorica said quietly, "a long time before that night, that if the choice was ever between my safety and yours, I was going to choose yours." The corridor felt very small. Garrett pushed off the wall. He walked 3 steps closer to the bars. Merrick opened his eyes and watched him approach, and this time, for the first time in 9 days, he moved. He stepped back from the bars, not in retreat, in invitation. Garrett crouched down so he was at eye level with Zorica through the bars. She was looking at him steadily, without defiance, without pleading. Just steady, like someone who had already paid the price they had decided the thing was worth and had no complaints about the arithmetic. "Why," he said. It was the only word he could fit through the tightness in his chest. Zorica held his gaze for a long moment. "Because," she said, very carefully, "you are a better king than you know, and Dirk Acheron has spent 4 years trying to ensure that you never find that out." The words hit him somewhere unguarded. He stood. He looked at the cell door. He looked at Merrick, who had sat back down beside Zorica with the patient, immovable certainty of a creature that had already decided how this was going to end. "I am going to get you out of here," Garrett said. "Not yet," Zorica said immediately. He looked at her. She was shaking her head just slightly. Her eyes urgent. If you open that door right now, Acheron will know the plan has unraveled. He has people watching this corridor. He needs to believe he is still winning. A pause. You need to give me 2 more days. You have been down here 9 days. I know how long I've been down here, she said, with a flash of something sharp and warm in those amber eyes. The first thing she had said with any heat in it. I've had considerable time to think. 2 more days. Let him believe you came down here and I refused to speak and you went away convinced. Let him move. When he moves, you'll see the whole shape of it. Garrett stared at her. She stared back. Merk turned his head and looked at Garrett, and the expression on the werewolf's enormous face was so unmistakably she's right. Listen to her that. Under any other circumstance, it would have been almost funny. 2 days, Garrett said. 2 days, Zorica agreed. He straightened, he turned, he walked back down the corridor toward the door. Garrett. He stopped at the sound of his name, not his title, his name spoken in that voice. Bring him something to eat before you go, she said. He's been refusing everything they send. He'll take it from you. Garrett stood very still for a moment. Then he said, without turning, he'll take it from you. A silence. He hasn't eaten in 9 days, she said, and for the first time her voice cracked just slightly around the edges. Please. He turned back. He looked at the wolf. Merk was watching him with those luminous amber eyes, and in them, in the bond that existed between them, old as Garrett's blood, he could feel what the wolf felt, could feel it as clearly as if Merk were speaking. She needs to see that you have chosen her. She won't eat until she knows you believe her. Feed me from her hand and she will eat. That is the order of things. Garrett went back to the guard station at the end of the corridor. He came back with the food that had been left untouched outside the bars, cold roasted meat, a heel of bread. He passed it through the bars without comment. Zorica looked at it in her hands, then she looked at Merk. Come on then, she whispered. The great silver wolf walked toward her. He ate from her hands, slowly, deliberately, his enormous head bent over her lap, her chained wrists resting in his fur. Zorica ate the bread. Garrett watched for a moment, then he walked away. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of the wolf settling, and a long, slow exhale that might have been relief. Garrett returned to his war chamber, and did something he had not done in 4 years of rule. He locked the door. Not against enemies, against his own counsel. He sat at the long table alone, with the record Boras had finally brought him, the arrest log, the initial evidence report, the correspondence that had allegedly been found in Zorica Vane's chambers, and he read them the way he should have read them 11 days ago. Slowly, without Dirk Acheron translating. The letters were the first problem. They were written in Zorica's hand, or something very close to it, addressed to Lord Edric Thorne of the Southern Reaches, outlining a plan to compromise the Unity Cup during the Accord ceremony. The language was careful, the phrasing precise, the penmanship controlled. Too controlled. Garrett had spent the better part of 3 years reading Zorica Vane's records. Her actual writing, her daily log entries, her Accord documents, her margin notations, had a specific quality to it. She thought fast. Her pen kept up with her thoughts rather than the other way around, which meant her real writing had the occasional compressed word, the letter formations that ran together at speed, the slight forward tilt of someone writing quickly in low light. These letters were slow, careful, written by someone concentrating very hard on copying a hand they had studied, rather than writing their own. He would have missed it a week ago. He didn't miss it now. The second problem was the timeline. Dirk had told him the correspondence had been discovered in Zorica's chambers that morning, the morning of the Accord ceremony. But according to the arrest log, which Boras had signed and dated, the search of Zorica's chambers had been authorized at the 3rd bell of the morning, which was 4 hours before the ceremony began. 4 hours. The search had been authorized and executed 4 hours before Zorica had done anything to justify a search of her chambers. Someone had known what she was going to do before she did it. And this was the thought that turned Garrett's blood cold and still in his veins. Someone had known what was going to happen at the ceremony, had planted the evidence the night before, and had authorized the search in advance to ensure the discovery was on record by the time anyone started asking questions. Garrett set down the papers. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. His inner wolf, the one that lived in his chest, the one that surfaced when the alpha instinct moved through him like a current, was packing. He could feel it. The same restless, angry circling that preceded a shift, the pressure building behind his ribs, the heat moving up his spine. Not now. He breathed it back. He needed to think, not feel. He thought about Dirk Acheron, 52 years old, High Steward for 6 years, appointed by Garrett's predecessor, his uncle, King Davor Dragmore, who had died of a winter fever 3 months after Garrett came of age and assumed the throne. Dirk had stayed on, smooth and useful and indispensable, managing the court's machinery so seamlessly that Garrett had never questioned the machine. He thought about what Zorica had said. He has spent 4 years trying to ensure that you never find that out. He thought about the decisions of the past 4 years that Dirk had managed, the trade routes adjusted, the border garrison strengths he had reported, the lords whose loyalty he had vouched for, and the lords he had quietly described as unreliable. The information that had shaped every strategic decision Garrett had made since he sat on the throne at 22. How much of it was real? How much of it had been the cage Dirk had built around him? Invisible bars, no iron required. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about something his father had told him, on the day he had first shifted, the day the wolf had come out of him for the first time, violent and overwhelming and terrifying the way any true thing is terrifying the first time you feel it without the padding of theory. His father had sat beside him afterward on the cold ground of the training yard, both of them looking at the sky. The wolf doesn't lie, his father had said. Not to him exactly, more to the air, the way his father said the things that mattered. A man can tell himself stories. A man can believe his own fictions if he tells them often enough. The wolf cannot. The wolf smells the truth behind the story every time. That is why the bond is a gift, because when you forget who you are, the wolf remembers. That is also why the bond is a weight, because the wolf will not let you hide from what you already know. Garrett had been 12 years old and had not known what his father meant. He had thought it was the kind of speech that fathers made after significant moments, the words large and the meaning vague, the way ceremonies were. He understood it now. Merk had known 11 days ago. From the moment Zorica knocked the cup from his hand and went to the floor under the guard's weight, the werewolf had known that the woman on the ground was not an enemy. Garrett had felt it, had felt the bond transmit it, that confused surge of protective instinct from the wolf that should not have been there, that he had overridden because Dirk Acheron was in his ear and 300 people were watching, and the cup was already on the floor, and the moment was moving faster than he could hold it. He had overridden the bond. That was, he understood now, the only real mistake, not the delay, not the imprisonment. Those were consequences. The mistake was the single moment when he had felt the wolf tell him something and had chosen the room's story over the wolf's truth. He filed that away too, in a place he intended to return to and look at honestly, because the Alpha King of Valdres Keep was not a man who could afford to make that mistake again. A knock at the door. "Who is it?" Garrett said. His voice was level. "Dirk Acheron, Your Grace. I wondered if you had been to see the prisoner and whether there was anything useful." A beat of silence. Garrett gathered the papers on the table and turned them face down. He unlocked the door. Dirk Acheron was exactly as he always was, neat, composed. his silver hair combed back, his expression carrying that particular blend of warmth and efficiency that Garrett had always read as competence. Now he read it as a performance. "Nothing useful," Garrett said. "She still refuses to speak." Something moved behind Dirk's eyes, relief quickly buried. "A shame," Dirk said, "though perhaps not surprising. Guilt tends to produce silence as readily as innocence. The mechanism is shame rather than strategy, usually." He paused. "The court grows restless, my king. The longer this continues, the more unsettling the optics. The wolf at her cell, the king visiting personally. It raises questions we may not be able to answer cleanly if we wait too long." The wolf at her cell, the king visiting personally. He had been watching, of course he had. "I hear you," Garrett said. "Give me a few days, I want to be certain." "Of course," Dirk said warmly. "Take all the time you need." He left. Garrett stood in the center of his war chamber, alone, and thought. 2 days. He spent those 2 days doing nothing visible. Internally, he worked. He sent a message, not through Dirk's network of scribes, but through Boris Keld, whose loyalty was old and without politics, to Captain Ryn Ashford of the keep's outside garrison, a man Dirk had once described as too blunt to be useful in any advisory capacity, which Garrett now read as, "A man I could not manage." He asked Ashford to quietly account for the whereabouts of Dirk's 6 personal attendants on the night before the accord ceremony. He asked Boris to produce from the physical archive the original document requesting authorization of the chamber search, not a copy, the original with whatever marks were on it. He asked, through a back channel, for the physician who had briefly attended Zorica in the first days of her imprisonment, asking only whether her initial condition was consistent with a woman who had spent weeks in contact with the kind of chemical agent found in the Unity Cup. A woman handling that kind of substance would have trace exposure. She had none. The report came back in a day and a half. The physician, puzzled by the question, said that Zorica Vane had showed no chemical exposure markers whatsoever. Whatever had been in the Unity Cup, she had not mixed it. The search authorization document came back the same afternoon. It was in Dirk's hand, and in the date-time notation, written with the particular compression of someone filling in a field quickly, the 3rd bell was followed by a correction, a scraped-over mark where the first notation had clearly read the 5th bell. He had written the 5th bell, the time the search actually happened, and then scraped it and written the 3rd, to push the timeline backward, to make it look like the search had been authorized before Zorica acted. But he had been in a hurry, and he had not scraped it cleanly enough. On the morning of the 2nd day, Captain Ashford returned a quiet verbal report. 2 of Dirk Acheron's personal attendants had spent the night before the ceremony in a chamber adjoining the document archive. They had signed out a set of archive keys in the afternoon. They had signed the keys back in at the 2nd bell of morning, 3 hours after the archive would have been empty of all staff, including Zorica. Garrett sat with all of this in his locked war chamber, and for a long moment he said nothing and did nothing. His wolf moved in his chest, not packing now. Ready. On the evening of the 2nd day, Garrett went back down to the holding ward. He went alone, as before. He dismissed the night guard from the corridor, which was unusual enough that the man stared, then obeyed without question, because you did not question the Alpha King with that particular set of his shoulders. Garrett sat down on the stone floor outside cell 44. Not standing, not leaning, sitting, his back against the opposite wall, his forearms on his knees, so that he was at a level with Merk, who had repositioned himself against the bars again and regarded his Alpha with steady, patient gold eyes. Zorica was asleep. He had not expected that. She was curled in the corner with the wool blanket, and she was actually sleeping, not performing sleep, not pretending. Her breathing was slow and even, her chained hands resting loose in the fur of Merk's flank where it pressed through the bars. Garrett looked at them, the werewolf and the record keeper, and something in his chest did a slow, complicated thing that he didn't want to examine too closely. He had known Zorica Vane for 2 years. She had been appointed to her position by his predecessor's chamberlain, a detail that had made her invisible to the internal politics of his own court. She belonged to the old administration's paperwork, essentially. She had no patron. She attended no dinners. She appeared at the events she was required to attend, did her work with absolute precision, and disappeared again. She had been in the room for every treaty, every accord, every formal ceremony of his reign, and she had been, in all that time, so consistently present and so consistently unremarkable to everyone else that Garrett had almost not noticed the moment he started noticing her. It had happened gradually, the way certain things happen, not with a single event, but with an accumulation of small moments that you only recognize as significant in retrospect. A margin note in an accord document 7 months ago that had caught his eye, a careful, minute notation in her hand, alongside the transcript of a border negotiation that said simply, Lord Cray's figures conflict with last quarter's supply record. Recommend verification before signing. He had verified. The figures were wrong. Lord Cray had quietly withdrawn the clause. She had saved him a significant territorial concession with 12 words in the margin of a document, and she had done it without ever speaking to him directly, without credit or acknowledgement, simply because it was accurate and it was her job to notice. There had been other moments. The way she moved through a crowded hall, not invisible exactly, but with the particular grace of someone who had learned to take up exactly the space they needed and no more, leaving everyone else undisturbed. The way she sometimes caught his eye across a ceremony room with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite assessment, but something between. He had told himself it was nothing. In the cold quiet of the holding ward, with his werewolf sleeping against her hands and 2 years of overlooked moments suddenly illuminated by what the past 11 days had revealed, Garrett thought, I have been an idiot. Zorica stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, and she had the disoriented look of someone waking in the dark in an unfamiliar place. And then the familiar weight of the situation settled back over her face, and she was fully awake and alert in the space of 2 breaths. She looked at him sitting against the opposite wall and said, You found something. Several things, he said. Merrick was awake too now, watching them both. Tell me, she said. He did, all of it, the letters, the timeline, the authorization document, the archive keys, the physician's report. He laid it out plainly, in order, the way she would have laid out a record. Facts, sequence, conclusion. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The scraped correction on the document, she said finally. Is it recoverable? Can you show the original notation clearly enough to a witness? Boras believes so, with the right light source. He used to authenticate old manuscripts before he came to the keep. She nodded slowly. Something was working behind those amber eyes, not hope exactly, but the careful, methodical motion of a mind building a structure. He won't expect the document, she said. He believes it's clean. That's his blind spot. He's thorough, but he's thorough in the direction he planned. He doesn't account for the things he thinks are already buried. She paused. When do you want to move? Tomorrow, Garrett said, at the midday court session, while everyone is present. She met his eyes. It needs to be public, she said, reading him perfectly. The same way the arrest was public. The court needs to see it undone in the same space it was done. Yes. A silence. Then Zorica said, quietly, something she had clearly decided several times not to say and had decided now that she would. After this is over, whether it works or not, I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. Garrett felt the words land somewhere uncomfortably central. The part where you spent 11 days in a prison cell, he said. The part where I chose, she said simply. Her eyes were steady and amber and entirely too clear. I knew what I was choosing. I'd choose it again. He should have said something measured, something appropriate to the circumstances and the relationship, which was, formally, that of a king and an appointed staff member, separated by bars and his own spectacular failure of judgment. Instead, he said, "I should have come down here on the first day." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Yes, you should have." No softening, no reassurance, just the clean truth delivered with the same even-handedness she applied to everything. It landed on him like a hand placed flat on a wound. "When this is over," he said, "I intend to make that right." She studied him. "That's a very broad statement." "It's intentional." Another silence. Merk was watching this exchange with his chin on the floor and his ears moving between them like a creature tracking a tennis match played in a language he understood better than either of the players. Zorica looked down at the wolf, pressed her fingers into the scruff of his neck. Merk closed his eyes. "Get some sleep," she said to Garrett without looking up. "Tomorrow is going to be complicated." He almost smiled. "Are you telling the Alpha King to go to bed?" "I'm telling Garrett to get some rest," she said, and looked up at him with that amber directness. "Because he's going to need to be sharp tomorrow, and right now he looks like a man who has been carrying a heavy thing for 11 days without putting it down." He stood. He looked at her through the bars, the chains, the blanket, the ink stains on her fingers, the steadiness of her eyes. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He walked away. And this time, when he turned the corner at the end of the corridor, he heard, just barely, Zorica's quiet voice saying something to Merk in the dark. Not words he could catch. Something soft and reassuring. And the wolf's answering sound low, warm, not a whimper this time. Something that sounded, in the dark under the mountain, remarkably like hope. Midday court at Valdres Keep was not a formal ceremony. It was a working session. Lords, captains, advisors, and legal officers gathered in the great hall to manage the ongoing business of the kingdom. Disputes were heard, orders were ratified, records were updated. It was exactly the kind of gathering in which things could be calmly, procedurally, unrecoverably dismantled. Garrett took his seat on the throne at the front of the hall with the controlled, unhurried precision of a man who had decided on a course of action and had no doubts left. Dirk Acheron sat at the high table to his left, as he always did, with his thin hands folded and his expression carrying its habitual warmth. There were perhaps 40 people in the hall. Lords, their attachés, court officers, guards, enough witnesses. Garrett let the first hour pass normally. He heard a border dispute. He ratified a supply order. He signed 2 documents that Boras, standing at his left shoulder in the place usually occupied by Dirk's own secretary, presented to him. He felt Dirk watching, could feel the measured quality of the man's attention, not worried yet but tracking. At the second bell of the session, Garrett said, "There is a matter I want addressed before we close." Dirk leaned slightly forward. "The case of Zorica Vane," Garrett said. The hall stilled. People who had been speaking to their neighbors stopped. Lord Commander Stoke across the table straightened. "I have reviewed the arrest evidence personally," Garrett said. He spoke without elevation, without ceremony, the way he would read out a supply route decision, just as factual, just as final. "I have found 3 inconsistencies that require explanation." He laid out the letters first. Captain Ashford, standing at the back of the hall with 2 members of the outside garrison, stepped forward and confirmed the physical analysis of the handwriting at Garrett's request, delivered verbally, clearly, in front of the room. A man trained in document verification. His conclusion was that the letters showed evidence of deliberate imitation rather than natural composition. A shifting in the room, people looking at one another. Dirk Acheron said smoothly, "My king, handwriting analysis of this kind is a subjective tool." "I am not finished," Garrett said. The High Steward closed his mouth. Garrett placed the search authorization document on the table. He asked Boris to describe what he had found. Boris, steady, factual in the tone of a man who had authenticated documents for 30 years, described the scraped notation, the original time, the correction. He had brought the document under a directed light source. He held it up. The correction was visible to everyone in the hall who cared to look. The hall was very quiet now. The chamber search was authorized 3 hours before the prisoner took any action that would justify a search, Garrett said. This requires explanation. Dirk Acheron stood. His face was composed. Only his eyes, Garrett noted, had changed. Something had gone out of them. Not guilt, not fear, something colder. My king, I believe there is a reasonable. The authorization is in your hand, Dirk, Garrett said. The correction is in your hand. I am asking you, in front of this court, to explain how a search was authorized before the prisoner's alleged actions took place. The room was absolutely still now. Dirk Acheron looked at Garrett, and for the first time in 4 years of standing next to him, the High Steward's face showed Garrett something true, a single, unguarded moment of calculation, measuring odds, looking for an exit. He found none. His composure fractured very slightly at the corners. The prisoner conspired against you, my king, whatever the specifics of the timeline, the outcome. Bring her up, Garrett said. 2 of Garrett's personal guard, men Boris had quietly reassigned from duties under Dirk's coordination, 2 days ago left the hall. The room held its breath. They came back 3 minutes later. Zorica Vane walked into the great hall of Valdres Keep, still in the worn dress she had been arrested in, her wrists still bearing the red marks the chains had left. She walked without help, without hurry, with the absolute composure of a woman who had decided, 11 days ago, exactly who she was and had not moved from that decision since. Merk came in behind her. The great silver werewolf, enormous and terrible and radiating the quiet authority of a creature that had already chosen its position, walked at her left side. He was not leashed. No one in the room attempted to stop him. The hall erupted, not in shouting, but in the particular sound of 40 people exhaling, repositioning, suddenly unable to maintain the social fiction that this was an ordinary proceeding. Dirk Acheron looked at Zorica Vane, and then at the wolf, and something moved across his face that Garrett recognized from his years of watching battle. The moment a man understands that the ground has shifted, and he did not feel it moving. Zorica Vane walked to the center of the hall. She did not look at Dirk. She looked at Garrett, and he gave the smallest nod, and she began to speak. She recounted what she had heard outside the archive. She recounted it precisely in the specific, ordered language of her profession, timestamps, exact wording, physical detail. No embellishment, just record. And then she said, I was in that archive the previous night, working late on the seal impressions. I heard Lord Acheron's voice through the door, but I was not alone in the archive. A pause. I was with the archive assistant, Nemtarn, who was finishing the binding on the winter records. He heard the same conversation I heard. He was too frightened to come forward. Her amber eyes were steady and bright. I would ask that he be brought in now. The young archive assistant was outside in the corridor, where Captain Ashford had quietly collected him that morning, at Zorica's request, passed through Boris the previous night. He came in. He was visibly terrified. He confirmed in a shaking voice every word Zorica had said. Dirk Acheron did not have many moves left, and the one he chose was the wrong one. He turned to Lord Commander Stoke with a look that expected support, an old habit of the powerful who expect the network to hold. Stoke looked back at him, and then at the Alpha King, and stepped back very slightly, in the silent way of a man who has just chosen a side. The web broke. It broke publicly in the great hall in front of 40 witnesses, as Zorica Vane had needed it to, as she had planned for it to, from the floor of cell 44. In the aftermath, There was no single dramatic moment of Dirk Acheron being dragged away screaming. What there was, instead, was a procedural unraveling that was, in its own way, worse for the dignity of the man. A series of quiet, factual steps as two of Garrett's guard flanked him. And the High Steward was escorted from the great hall with the same composed efficiency with which he had managed everything else, except now it was being managed for him. He said nothing as he left. That was what people remembered later, that he said nothing. Not a protest, not an appeal, not a final attempt at the smooth persuasion that had served him for so long. He simply left because there was nothing left to say, and he was, at his core, a precise man, and a precise man knows when a column of figures no longer adds up. The other names that emerged in the following hours were less composed. 3 of Dirk's inner staff, interrogated separately by Captain Ashford, gave varying accounts that all converged on the same basic structure. Dirk had been managing communications between Lord Edric Thorne of the Southern Reaches and a faction of the Northern nobility for 2 years. The Unity Cup had been the endgame of a longer plan. Garrett's death to be blamed on Thorne's delegates, triggering a war between the Northern Pact territories and the Southern Reaches, while Dirk's chosen successor, a pliable young lord named Korev Dane, whose considerable debts Dirk had been quietly purchasing for 3 years, was positioned to assume the throne in the chaos. It was, Zorica said later when Garrett explained it to her in the quiet of the war chamber, very well constructed. He is a very good administrator, she said, without a trace of irony. It's a shame. Garrett looked at her. She was sitting across the long table from him, a cup of heated broth in her chained hands. He had not yet had the chains removed, which was a bureaucratic failure he was going to address in the next 30 seconds, and she looked, for the first time, exhausted. Not broken. Just as though she had been carrying something for 11 days and had now been allowed to set it down. "The chains," he said. "Yes," she said. "They should come off." "That would be a reasonable position to take," she agreed. He found this somehow genuinely funny, and the laugh that came out of him was a short, rough sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. She blinked at him, and then the corner of her mouth moved, and for a moment it was almost a smile. He called for a key. The chains came off. She rubbed her wrists carefully, and Merk, who had been lying under the table at her feet in a manner completely incompatible with the dignity of a war wolf but entirely consistent with what he was, looked up at the sound of the chains releasing and then put his head back down with a long sigh. "He hasn't left your side," Garrett observed. "He came to me on the second night," Zorica said. She looked down at the wolf. "I hadn't slept. It was very cold, and I was sitting in the dark trying not to be frightened, and I heard him coming down the corridor, and I thought he was coming to see if I was dead." A pause. "He pushed his nose through the bars, and he just stayed there, and I held on to him, and eventually I slept." Garrett said nothing for a moment. "Then Merk and I bonded when I was 12. He chose me over 17 other alpha candidates. I have never, in all the years since, seen him choose another person. He guards me in battle. He follows my commands in wolf form, but he has never, to my knowledge, decided on his own to guard someone else." He paused. "Until you." Zorica looked at Merk. "He knew I wasn't guilty," she said simply. "Animals are honest like that." "There is more to it than that," Garrett said. She looked up. He held her gaze. There was something in the air between them, the same thing there had been in the corridor the night before, large and real and patient. "He bonded to you," Garrett said. "That is what it's called when a war wolf extends a guardian bond outside the alpha line. It is rare. It requires a specific quality of character." He paused. "It is considered a form of recognition." "Recognition of what?" she asked. Garrett held her eyes. "Of someone worth guarding." The broth in her hands had gone still. She was not moving. "That is a significant statement," she said carefully. "I know," he said. Merk, from under the table, made a sound, a low, satisfied sound that was unmistakably smug for a creature that had no business being smug about anything, and both of them looked at him, and the moment broke into something warm and a little helpless that was not quite a smile on either of their faces but was not far from it. "He is insufferably pleased with himself," Garrett said. "He should be," Zorica said. "He's the only one of us who knew what was happening from the beginning." Garrett looked at the wolf. "Don't let him hear you say that. He'll be impossible for weeks." She did smile then, briefly, fully, a real one, the kind that reached her eyes and disappeared fast, as if she was still getting used to having things to smile about. It hit Garrett squarely in the chest. He filed that away for later. They had a great deal to resolve first. But he filed it away. What Garrett did not tell anyone, what he told only Boras, as a matter of safety, was that after the midday court session, while Dirk Acheron was being held and his network was being carefully unraveled, Lord Edric Thorne of the Southern Reaches had sent a message. Not an official message. A private one delivered by a runner who came through the servants' entrance, addressed to no one, folded without a seal. Inside it 3 words, "The wolf knows." Garrett read it twice. Then he gave it to Boras and told him to lock it with the other evidence. The wolf knows meant that someone in the Southern Reaches network, someone who had not yet been identified, was aware that Merk's behavior had exposed the plan. It meant Dirk was not the only loose thread. It meant there were people outside Valdres Keep who would find it very useful if Zorica Vane did not survive to give testimony at the formal tribunal. He brought Zorica back to the upper keep, out of the holding ward, and had her placed in a proper chamber with a fire and a door that locked. He tripled the guard on the outer courtyard. He sent Captain Ashford with a small garrison to close the servants' entrance. He also shifted. He did it privately, in the cold stone space below the main stables, where he had always shifted when he needed to move fast and unseen. His body knew the change, had known it since he was 16, smooth and involuntary as breathing, bones and muscle, finding their other shape without resistance. His mind sliding sideways into the wider, brighter, scent-saturated awareness of the wolf. In wolf form, Garrett was large, not as large as Merk, who was a full war wolf and built for battle, but considerably larger than a natural wolf, and built with the particular combination of speed and power that an alpha bloodline produced. His coat was a dark gray, almost black in low light, with a paler gray at his chest and jaw. He ran the perimeter of the keep. He did it twice. He was not looking for threats in the way a guard looks for threats. He was looking for wrongness. The alpha instinct reading the air, the ground, the patterns of movement in and out of the structure. He was looking for the thing that didn't belong, the scent that was familiar but shouldn't be, the footfall that was slightly too quiet. He found it on the second circuit. On the east wall, where the servants' entrance was supposed to be locked and guarded, there was a person who was trying, with considerable skill and very little success, to remain entirely still in the shadow of the wall. Garrett shifted back at the corner of the stables, fast enough that it was done before the figure could register the movement, dressed again in the guard captain's heavy coat he had left folded on a barrel for this purpose, and walked around the corner. The figure in the shadow was not a professional. He was young, perhaps 18, and when Garrett stepped in front of him, the expression on his face was less trained operative and more "I am in a lot of trouble." His name turned out to be Dar Coven. He was, it also turned out, one of Edric Thorne's young clerks, sent north under the cover of the Accord delegation with 3 specific tasks: observe, report, and if the main plan failed, do something that a frightened, idealistic young man in over his head had clearly not been prepared to actually do when it was real and standing in front of him. What came out of Dar Coven in the next hour, in the presence of Garrett and Ashford and Boras, was more valuable than anything from Dirk's household, Because Darkoven was young and frightened and not particularly hardened, and because he had clearly had a miserable several months and had been waiting, with some desperation, for someone to give him permission to tell the truth. He told them about Lord Thorn's network, names, locations, communication routes. He told them about the 3 other keep staff who were reporting south. He told them about the original plan, which had been larger and more complex than even Garrett had understood, and which had begun, not 2 years ago, but 6 years ago, before Garrett was even on the throne, when it was already clear that Davor Dragmore's health was failing and the question of succession was live. He told them that Zorica Vane's name had been selected as the target, the convenient vessel for the blame, 8 months ago, because someone in the network had noted that she was trusted by the Alpha King's office, had access to relevant documents, had no political protector, and had recently begun to be noticed by the king himself. That last part landed oddly. Noticed, Garrett repeated. Darkoven nodded miserably. The report said she was becoming visible to you. Lord Acheron noted it. He said it was an asset that could be used. If she was close enough to you to be visible, she was close enough to make the accusation credible. The asset that Dirk had planned to use against him was the beginning of something Garrett had not given himself permission to name yet. He filed it away again, in the same place he was keeping the other things. Later, much later in the evening, he went to the chamber where Zorica had been placed. He knocked. He heard her footsteps, heard her pause on the other side of the door. "Who's there?" she said. "Garrett." A short silence. The bolt drew back. She had been given fresh clothing, a simple dark wool dress, her hair brushed and braided, the marks on her wrists fatting. She looked more like herself, he thought, though he was aware he was probably constructing a fiction there, since he had not known her well enough to know what herself looked like, comfortable and rested. Merk was behind her. The wolf filled most of the chamber, taking up the space in front of the fireplace with his usual magnificent disregard for inconvenience. Garrett came in. He told her about Darkoven. He told her what the boy had said about the network, about the timeline, about the plan that had started 6 years ago. When he told her that her name had been chosen 8 months ago, specifically because she had become noticeable to him, her face went very still for a moment. He watched her absorb this, the fact that being seen had been weaponized, that proximity to him had been the mechanism of her destruction. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked up at him. "That one is not yours to apologize for. If I had been paying better attention, then Dirk would have chosen someone else and that person would be in the cell instead of me," she said evenly. "The plan was not a response to me. I was a detail in a plan. The plan existed regardless." A pause. "Stop collecting guilt that doesn't belong to you." He looked at her. "I have plenty of legitimate guilt to be getting on with," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Focus on that." Merk exhaled from the fireplace, loudly, in a way that was impossible to interpret as anything other than commentary. "He is doing that thing where he sounds like a commentary," Zorica said. "He always does that," Garrett said. "Does he do it to you when you're being stubborn?" "Constantly." She almost smiled again. He was getting better at catching the almost smiles. They were fast, like birds startling from a branch, but they were there. "I should go," he said, and did not move for a moment. She looked at him with those amber eyes, steady as always, but with something in them now that had not been there in the cell, something less guarded. The faint opening of a door. "Good night, Garrett," she said. "Good night, Zorica," he said. He went. In the corridor, he stood for a moment with one hand on the stone wall, and thought that he had won today, and stopped a conspiracy, and restored an innocent person from unjust imprisonment, and still, the thing that sat most heavily in his chest was not relief or satisfaction. It was the very specific weight of wanting more time in that room. 3 weeks passed between the midday court session and the formal tribunal that adjudicated the treason case. They were 3 weeks of careful, difficult work. The network was dismantled methodically. The 3 keep staff who had been reporting south were removed without announcement. Lord Edric Thorne of the Southern Reaches, faced with the testimony of Dar Coven and the correspondence from Dirk's archive, sent a formal withdrawal from the accord and a communication that stopped just short of an admission. The communication of a man who had been caught holding a weapon and was trying to establish that he had only been holding it, not using it. The Alpha Council, the 7 lords who served as Garrett's advisory body, convened in an extended session to hear the full scope of what had been uncovered. Zorica was present for some of those sessions. Garrett had asked her to be, formally, as a witness, but she was also, quietly, present in a different capacity, sitting to the right of the war table with a small writing desk and the particular stillness of someone taking notes in a way that was also, unmistakably, thinking alongside. 2 of the council lords had noticed this by the 3rd session and had begun directing questions at her directly. She had answered them without looking to Garrett for permission, which he had appreciated deeply, and which had seemed to confuse the lords in equal measure. By the 4th session, Lord Harvin of the East Reach, the oldest member of the council, 70 years old and famously unimpressed by anything, had asked her opinion on the proposed dissolution of Dirk Acheron's administrative structure, and whether it should be rebuilt from within or rebuilt from outside the existing staff. She had given him a precise, 3-part analysis in approximately 4 minutes that had produced a silence of collective recalibration around the table. Harvin had looked at Garrett. "Where has she been?" he said. "At a small desk in the document archive," Garrett said. "That is a significant waste of a resource," Harvin said, with the bluntness of a man who had stopped caring what people thought of his opinions around 40 years ago. Garrett had met Zorica's eyes across the table. She was looking down at her notes, but the line of her mouth was doing that thing again. The tribunal was held on a clear winter morning when the sky over Valdres Keep was a hard, pale blue, and the snow in the courtyard had frozen overnight into a surface that caught the sunlight like hammered silver. The great hall had been configured formally, the Alpha King's chair at the center front, the council lords flanking, the witnesses arranged to the right, the legal officers at the far table. Dirk Acheron was brought in. He had not changed visibly. He was still neat, still composed, still carrying himself with the posture of a man who believed that a situation could always be managed if you kept your head. Only the absence of his high steward's insignia, removed by protocol at arrest, made him look incomplete, like a sentence missing its final word. The case was presented in full over 3 hours. Zorica spoke for 40 minutes of those 3 hours. She spoke in the clear, ordered voice of someone reading a record into the permanent ledger, which she was, because everything said at the tribunal would become part of the permanent historical record of the reign, and she knew it, and she chose every word accordingly. She was neither vindictive nor merciful. She was accurate. She was thorough. When she was done, Dirk Acheron looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You are very good at your work." It was not a compliment. It was the acknowledgement of a craftsman recognizing the quality of the thing that had undone him. "Yes," she said, "I am." Dirk Acheron's defense, presented by a legal officer he had retained from outside the keep, a careful man in a gray coat who had clearly been well briefed, was intelligent. It challenged the handwriting analysis on technical grounds. It offered an alternative reading of the search authorization timeline in which the scraped notation was a simple clerical error rather than a deliberate correction. It suggested that Dar Coven's testimony, offered by a frightened young man under considerable pressure, carried obvious credibility issues. None of it worked, because the defense was built for a single thread of evidence, and Zorica had built her case with 7. When the defense concluded, the hall was quiet. Garrett had not spoken during the proceedings beyond the formal requirements. But in the quiet after the defense finished, he looked at Dirk Acheron, really looked, the way he had been avoiding looking for 4 years, and he said, very simply, "You have managed this court well. I don't doubt that. But management is not the same as service, and there is a difference between a man who keeps the machine running and a man who has decided the machine belongs to him." Dirk met his eyes. For the first and only time, something cracked in the composure, just a sliver, just a moment. "You are going to waste it," Dirk said. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the voice of a man saying the thing he had believed for a long time and had never said. "You were 22 and angry, and you were going to spend your reign being righteous and blunt and making enemies, and the kingdom was going to bleed for it. I was managing the future." "You were replacing it," Garrett said, "with a future of your own design in which I was not part of the picture." A silence. "Yes," Dirk said, "just that." It was the only honest thing he said in the entire tribunal, and perhaps for that reason, Garrett remembered it for a long time. The verdict was delivered at the session's close. Dirk Acheron, guilty of conspiracy against the Alpha King, manipulation of evidence, and conduct damaging to the peace of the realm. The sentence: removal of title, seizure of estate, permanent exile to the northern border settlements. Not a death sentence. Garrett had considered it. He had decided against it. When the council asked his reasoning, he had said only, "A king who executes in anger creates a precedent he cannot unwrite. Exile removes the threat. Death creates a martyr." What he did not say was that Zorica had said something to him, quietly, a week before. He is dangerous and should be removed, and he should also live with what he lost. Those two things are not contradictory. He also did not say that he had stood at the window of his locked war chamber the night before the tribunal, looking out at the dark valley, and thought about a 22-year-old king who had been handed a throne and a kingdom, and a very efficient, very practiced man who had made himself indispensable from the first week, and had told himself, sincerely, that he was being well served, that the machine was in good hands, that the smoothness of the administration was a sign of competence rather than control. He had been a different kind of naive than Dirk thought, not righteous and blunt and ruinous, just trusting in the wrong direction, toward the people who managed him rather than the people who looked at him straight and said what they actually thought. He thought about a margin note in a border negotiation document, and 12 words that had saved him a territorial concession. He thought about the difference between a person who manages and a person who serves, and he decided that the rest of his reign was going to look considerably different from the first 4 years. Dirk Acheron left the hall without looking at Garrett. He looked at Zorica once as he passed. Something complicated moved across his face, something that was not quite respect and not quite regret, but had elements of both. She looked back at him evenly, without hostility, without triumph. Just record. Afterwards, in the quieting hall, with the crowd dispersing around them, Garrett found himself standing beside her, both of them looking at the space where Dirk had been. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything. "Tired," she said. "Relieved. A little sad, which I wasn't expecting." "Sad?" "It was a very good plan," she said. "In a different world, that much intelligence and patience directed somewhere useful could have built something remarkable." A pause. "It's always sad when the capacity for something good turns out to be the same capacity for something terrible." He looked at her sideways. The winter light through the hall's high windows caught her face and her braided hair, and he thought, not for the first time, about the margin note 7 months ago. About all the things she had been doing, quietly and precisely, and without recognition, from a small desk in an archive that he had walked past 100 times. "Zorica," he said. She looked at him. "I want to appoint a new position," he said. "A formal one, with title, rank, and full council standing. someone to serve as the king's direct advisor on matters of intelligence, court strategy, and administrative integrity. A pause. I would like that person to be you. The hall was still. The people who were still gathering their things had stopped, in the way that people stop when they sense that something significant is being said nearby. Zorica was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "That is a significant change from Record Keeper." "Yes," he agreed. "The council will have opinions about it." "Harvin won't." Her mouth did the thing again, the near smile. "Lord Harvin is one vote." "Lord Harvin's vote comes with 30 years of credibility," Garrett said. "And I believe the other 6 are adjusting their understanding of the room fairly rapidly." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something working behind her eyes, not calculation, but the particular quality of someone who has lived a careful, measured life suddenly being asked whether they want something different. "Yes," she said, quiet certain, "I accept." Merk, who had been lying at the side of the hall's raised platform for the duration of the tribunal in the patient pose of a creature waiting for proceedings to conclude, stood up, shook himself, and walked to where they were standing. He sat between them, his great silver head level with their shoulders, and looked forward with the satisfied expression of a wolf who had known all along how things were going to go, and had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. Winter turned. Not quickly, the north never released its cold quickly, and the mountains above Valdres Keep still wore their white into the 4th month, but the light changed. Longer in the day, slightly warmer at the edges, the quality of cold shifting from aggressive to merely persistent. Garrett noticed it most in the early mornings when he shifted. He had shifted more in the weeks since the tribunal than he had in the preceding year, not for patrol or strategic purposes, but for the older reason, the one his father had told him about when he was young. A wolf that does not run grows heavy in himself. The shift is not just a weapon, it is a way of remembering what you are. He would run the mountain perimeter at first light, Merk alongside him, and come back human and cold, and more settled than he had been the night before. One morning, perhaps 6 weeks after the tribunal, he came around the lower run of the eastern ridge and found Zorica standing outside the keep's small lower gate, bundled in a heavy fur-lined cloak, her breath clouding in the morning air, watching the mountains. She heard them coming before she saw them, the soft, heavy percussion of 2 large wolves crossing the frozen ground at a run, and she turned. Merk broke away from Garrett and went directly to her, the way he always did now, his head dropping to her hand in a greeting that had become their ritual. She pressed her fingers into his ruff and looked over his head at Garrett, who was mid-shift. The shift back was fast, practiced, clean, but it was still a shift, which meant she was watching him go from wolf to man in the pale morning light, and there was a particular vulnerability in that, regardless of how many times he had done it, because the shift stripped away everything that was performance and left only what was real. He straightened. He reached for the cloak he had left on the fence rail and pulled it on. "Early morning," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, a kind of wondering that she was not quite concealing. "I've seen pack wolves shift before," she added. "I've never seen an alpha shift." "Different?" he asked. "More," she said simply. Merk had settled between them in the snow, sitting with his usual indifference to cold, his amber gaze moving between their faces in a way that managed to be both patient and pointed. "He keeps doing that," Zorica noted. "He's been doing it since we came back from the holding ward," Garrett said. "I have been choosing not to interpret it." "That seems wise," she said. A pause, then. "He used to whimper if I moved too far from the bars. Did you know that? The night guards told me afterward. He would press his muzzle through the gap, and if I moved to the other side of the cell, even just to pace, he would make that sound until I came back." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "He does that with me too," he said. "When I travel, he won't eat until I'm back." She looked down at Merk, who met her eyes without embarrassment. "You are an enormous sentimental animal," she told the wolf. Merk leaned his full weight against her legs. She grabbed his ruff to stay upright and laughed, a real one, surprised and warm, tumbling out into the cold morning air. Garrett stood still and listened to it. He had been doing a great deal of thinking in the past 6 weeks, not about the conspiracy or the tribunal or the administrative restructuring. He had been doing that thinking too, but it was the other thinking he meant. The kind that visited in the early mornings and the late evenings and during council sessions when her voice was explaining something, and his attention was, with some regularity, not on the content but on the quality of the voice itself. He was aware that this was a complicated landscape. She was now formally his chief advisor, which made the personal territory adjacent to the professional in ways that required care. She had been unjustly imprisoned, which created a debt and an imbalance that he did not want to be the foundation of anything. And she was, as far as he could determine from 6 weeks of very careful observation, not a person who had any interest in anything that was offered rather than earned. He had decided to tell her what he was thinking, and he had decided that the way to do it was the way she did everything, directly and without performance. "Zorica," he said. She was still holding Merk's ruff, steadied against the wolf's weight. She looked at Garrett. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as information, not as a request. You don't have to respond to it in kind or at all. But I've decided not to carry it without putting it into words, because carrying things without words is how I've been making decisions badly for 4 years." She had gone still, watchful, those amber eyes reading him. "I have been aware of you," he said, "not as a record keeper, and not as a witness, and not as an advisor, though you are all 3 of those things, since the margin note in the border negotiation document 7 months ago. I've been aware of you in a way that I chose not to examine too closely because I told myself the timing was wrong and the context was wrong and the position was wrong." A pause. "The timing is still not ideal. The context is complicated. The position has changed in ways that make some of the earlier complications smaller and creates new ones." He looked at her steadily. "But you are the most honest person in this keep, and it seems right that you should know the honest version of what is in my head." The morning was very quiet. Merk had stopped leaning and was sitting like a stone, not moving, barely seeming to breathe. Zorica looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt the particular discomfort of having said something true and needing to simply let it exist in the air without managing it. Then she said, "I have been trying not to think about you for considerably longer than 7 months." The words landed quietly and completely. "How long?" he asked. "Since the Border Lord's dinner 14 months ago," she said. "You were seated 2 chairs from me and you spent the entire first course asking the ambassador the questions everyone else was too polite to ask, and then you spent the second course listening to the answers, actually listening, not just waiting for your turn to speak." A pause. "It was the listening. I have an unfortunate weakness for people who actually listen." He wanted to say something. He had several options. He chose the simplest one. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Not the arm's length of professional courtesy, but closer, the kind of closer that is a question that the body asks before the voice does. She tilted her head back to hold his gaze. She did not step away. "This is still complicated," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "We should probably be careful." "We should," he said. "I am not the kind of person who can be managed," she said, with a directness that was almost gentle. "If this becomes whatever it becomes, I need you to understand that. I am not a ward. I'm not a responsibility. I've already established I'm capable of handling myself in a prison cell." He thought of her, chained in the corner of cell 44, feeding his werewolf through the bars, composing her case in silence over 9 days while the cold sat in her bones, and the court demanded her execution. He thought of her standing in the great hall speaking for 40 minutes in a voice that did not waver. "I am aware," he said, "of exactly what you are capable of." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she reached up, very deliberately, and pressed her palm flat against his chest, over the place where, in wolf form, his heart sits loudest. "All right," she said softly, "then let's be careful together." Merk stood up, shook the snow from his coat, and walked back toward the keep gate in the dignified manner of a creature who had overseen exactly the outcome he had been working toward for 11 days in a prison corridor, and felt no need to be subtle about his satisfaction. Spring came to the mountains in the way that things come when they have been a long time in arriving, not with a single decisive moment, but with an accumulation of small, certain changes. The snow on the upper peaks began to retreat by noon. The frozen courtyard cracked and softened. The first birds came back to the eastern tree line, and on the morning they arrived, Merk went and stood at the window of the war chamber for 20 minutes watching them, in the way wolves sometimes watch things they cannot explain but cannot look away from either. The keep itself had changed. It was not an easy change, and it was not a quick one. The removal of Dirk Acheron's network had left gaps in the administrative structure, in the trust between Garrett's inner circle and the larger court, in the information systems that had seemed so functional and turned out to be so thoroughly curated. These things did not fix themselves overnight. They required the careful, patient work of people who knew the difference between an empty gap and a space that needed rebuilding from different material. Zorica worked. She worked the way she had always worked, with complete attention, without performance, with the particular gift of someone who found order and clarity genuinely satisfying rather than merely useful. She rebuilt the document archive systems from the ground up. She restructured the council's reporting lines so that information reached Garrett through 3 independent channels rather than one managed one. She established, quietly and without announcement, a network of regional correspondents, minor officials, local record keepers, the kinds of people who are always in the room and never noticed, who sent weekly reports directly to her desk. Lord Harvin called it the most significant administrative advancement of the past 20 years in a public council session, with the gruff certainty of a man reading out a confirmed fact. Zorica, seated at the table beside Garrett, had written something in her margin notes and passed it sideways without comment. It said, "He is going to be insufferable about being right." Garrett had covered his mouth with his hand. The relationship between them was careful, as she had said. Careful in the way of 2 precise people who understand that a thing worth having is worth handling correctly. They had not announced anything, which was sensible given the newness of the council structure and the residual politics of Zorica's public profile after the tribunal. But the court, which noticed everything eventually, had begun to notice. They noticed the way Garrett consulted her at the end of council sessions, not formally but in the language of 2 people thinking alongside each other. They noticed that Merk, who had returned to his alpha's side in public settings but positioned himself, with characteristic wolf logic, between both of them, no longer sorted people by proximity to the king alone. He sorted them by proximity to the king and the advisor. That was a different calculation. Wolves did not make that calculation for people. They did not consider pack. They noticed, at the spring accord signing, the renegotiated version, the clean one, with the Southern Reaches delegation replaced and the Unity Cup conspicuously absent from the ceremony. That, when the signing was complete and the hall erupted in the relieved noise of a treaty restored, Garrett did not look at his lords or his captain or his council. He looked at her. She was at the side table, adding her seal to the record copies, and she felt his gaze and looked up. Across the hall and the noise and the ceremony, their eyes met, and she gave him the smallest nod, the kind that said, "Yes, we did this, yes, it's done," and he gave her the same nod back, and it was the most private conversation they had ever held in a room of 300 people. The spring accord was the last major formal piece of the work that had begun 11 days after the night they put her in the dark. Garrett did something that evening that he had not done in 4 years of rule. He shifted without a strategic reason. He went to the lower stables alone in the last of the afternoon light, and he let the change come not forced, not hurried, not the controlled, purposeful shift of a king who needs his wolf for a task. He let it come the way his father had shown him, the way that felt like water finding its level, like something held rigid finally releasing. In wolf form, the world opened. Sent first the deep pine cold of the mountain, the smoke from the keep's inner fires, the complex layered information of the courtyard. Who had been there and when and what they had been carrying, and whether they had been calm or hurried or afraid. The spring-thaw mud, new grass beginning under the old snow. The sharp, clean signature of a particular silver wolf nearby, and below it, underneath the wolf scent, warm and distinct, something that smelled like amber resin and ink, and he had come to understand decision. The smell of a person who decided things with clarity and kept what they decided. He ran. Not the perimeter route, not the patrol circuit. He ran straight up the mountain, off the established path, through the thinning tree line and out onto the open ridge above, where the wind was cold and sharp and the whole of the northern valley opened below him like an inhale. He ran until his lungs burned and his paws knew every stone in the ridge, and then he stopped at the top and stood with his nose into the wind, reading everything the wind had to say. He stayed up there for a long time. When he came back down, it was full evening and the stars were out. He shifted at the stable wall, dressed, and walked into the keep. And something he had been carrying, not guilt exactly, not grief, but the accumulated weight of 4 years of a kingdom managed by the wrong hands and a self managed by the wrong version of trust, had been left partially on the mountain. Not resolved, just lighter. He could work with lighter. The evening after the signing, Garrett went to the south-facing wall walk above the keep, the one that looked down the valley toward the lower settlements, now green with the first real growth of spring. He had been up here when he needed to think since he was 12 years old, and the view had never changed. Mountains, valley, sky, the smoke from the settlement hearths rising in small, distinct threads. He heard 2 sets of footsteps, one soft and one entirely too large and heavy to be stealthy. Zorica and Merk. She came to stand beside him at the parapet. Merk positioned himself between them and the wall, facing outward, the watchful posture he had adopted in the prison corridor, and apparently never seen reason to abandon. "It's done," Garrett said. "The formal part," she said. "Yes," a pause. "The informal parts are ongoing." "They always are," she said. "You don't actually finish this work, you just keep going." He looked at her. The evening light was doing something specific to her profile, catching the amber in her eyes, the line of her jaw, the particular way she held herself when she was looking at something and thinking something that she had not yet decided to say. "What are you not saying?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, then, "I was thinking about the first night in the cell, after your first visit when you told me 2 days and you left." She paused. "I sat with Merk and I thought this might be the last good thing, the last trust I'm placed in, the last plan I get to make, and I thought if it is, it was still worth it." He was very still. "It was worth it before you came back down," she said. "Not because of what happened afterward, because of the choice itself." Her voice was quiet and real and not performing anything. "I want you to know that. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, it didn't start because I needed rescuing. It started because I made a choice I would make again. That matters to me. That it was mine." He turned to face her. She turned to face him. "I know," he said. And then, "The day I walked down those stairs and Merk bared his teeth at me." "That must have been extremely alarming," she said. "Deeply alarming," he agreed. "But I knew in that moment that he was right to do it. He was protecting you from me, not from the guards. From me, my slow judgment, my failure to see, my willingness to let the story I was given stand in for the story that was true." He paused. "He was better than I was." He usually is, Zorica said. That's why you bonded to him. Merk made a sound, that low, warm, insufferably pleased sound. He keeps doing that, Garrett said. He knows exactly what he's doing, Zorica said. He always has, Garrett said. He reached out slowly and took her hand where it rested on the parapet stone. Her fingers closed around his, ink-stained and warm and deliberate. From the very beginning. Below the wall walk, the valley spread green and wide in the evening light. The keep behind them was full of the ordinary noise of a functioning, living place, voices, footsteps, the clatter of the evening kitchen. Above, the first stars were beginning to find their places in the darkening sky. Garrett, she said. Yes. You are still carrying the 11 days, she said. She knew him well enough now to read the weight. I can see it. I am, he said. Put it down, she said quietly. Not forgetting it, not excusing it, just put it down, you need your hands free. He looked at her. At those steady amber eyes that had looked at him from a prison floor and seen not the king, not the failure, not the man who had put her there, but the person who was still worth choosing. What do I need my hands for? He said. To keep building this, she said simply. The court, the council, the work. A pause, all of it. He looked at their joined hands on the stone. All of it, he said. She leaned her shoulder against his, warm against the evening cool, and they stood in companionable silence, watching the valley and the rising stars while Merk kept vigil beside them, as he always had, as he always would, the wolf who had known, from the very beginning, what none of the rest of them had understood yet. That the bond between them had always been there, waiting. It had only needed the dark to make it visible. In the years that followed, the story of Zorica Vane and the Alpha King's werewolf became one of the most told in the Northern Territories, not because of the conspiracy or the tribunal or the exile of Dirk Acheron, but because of the 9 days. 9 days when a great silver wolf refused every meal they brought him. 9 days when he ate only when she fed him through the prison bars. People who told the story always focused on the wolf, which was fitting. Wolves do not lie. Wolves do not manage impressions or construct narratives or choose convenient truths. A wolf sitting in the dark with a chained woman, refusing to leave her, refusing to eat, refusing to do anything but keep vigil. That is a wolf telling you everything you need to know. He had known what she was. He had known what she was worth. He had simply waited for the rest of them to catch up. If this story held you from the first word to the last, if you felt every moment of that cold corridor, every minute of those 9 days, every heartbeat of what it means to choose someone before you are certain you will be chosen back, then share it. Send it to someone who loves a story with real stakes and real hearts. And stay close, because the next story is already waiting in the dark, and it's going to be worth every second.